After Venezuela, next South American countries on U.S. target. Most of them have two properties, i.e. they have rare earth minerals, and they were used to be under USSR influence, especially with whom the USSR cultivated strong ties, such as with Cuba, a Caribbean island nation often grouped with Latin America, and sought influence in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Guyana, and Venezuela through economic deals, loans, tech, and support for leftist movements, though often preferring state-to-state relations over revolution. January 06, 2026. Subscribe to Defense Reports, your go-to source for timely, in-depth military and defense reports. I'm Alex. Join me with Arya in the latest podcast by Defense Report for a sharp, no-nonsense breakdowns of the latest in global defense news, military technology, and strategic developments. And today we're going to cover.
Well, today we're doing a deep dive into what is just a massive strategic shift in the Western Hemisphere. It all follows the forceful capture of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro.
An operation they call an absolute resolve.
Exactly. And our mission today is really to dissect what this signals, look at who might be the next regional targets, especially countries vital for the energy transition, and really what this all means for Europe and the war in Ukraine.
That's the part that I think is so critical. This wasn't just a political change. It was a military action that just seems to have shattered diplomatic norms.
It absolutely did. The shockwave is still spreading. The actual event, Maduro's capture on January 3rd, that was the big show.
Yeah.
The real shift, the thing we need to watch, is this new, highly interventionist U.S. policy framework. They're calling it the Dawn Row Doctrine.
Okay, so let's unpack the operation itself first.
Yeah.
Operation Absolute Resolve. Analysts are saying it was tactically successful, better executed than past attempts at regime change.
Oh, much better executed. But that tactical success is, it's a bit of a mirage if you don't have a plan for what comes next.
And they don't.
That's the huge contradiction. The intelligence reports are already warning that the planning for a post-regime transition is, and I'm quoting, incoherent at best.
So you have a deposed leader, but a total power vacuum.
A strategic vacuum. And that's why this new doctrine is so important. It provides the context for this kind of action.
All right, tell us about this Dawn Row Doctrine, or the Trump corollary. How is it different from the old Monroe Doctrine?
So the original doctrine was about warning European powers to stay out of the Americas. The Dawn Row Doctrine, it kind of flips that. It asserts that the U.S. has inherent unilateral authority to intervene in other Western Hemisphere nations.
On what grounds?
If their domestic policies are deemed an unusual and extraordinary threat to U.S. national security, it's a massive expansion of presidential power.
And I'm guessing unusual and extraordinary threat is a pretty broad definition.
It's incredibly broad. It could cover anything from judicial overreach in a foreign court to harboring criminal cartels or, and this is the key one, facilitating any significant Chinese or Russian military presence.
That immediately raises huge legal questions. I know analysts brought up the Noriega case from back in the 90s.
They did. And it's a valid comparison on the surface, seizing a foreign leader.
Right.
But the constitutional experts, they're much more worried this time.
Why?
Because the president unilaterally deploying the military to seize a head of state completely bypasses Congress's power to declare war. It sets a really dangerous precedent.
And how did our European allies react?
The reaction was sharp and immediate. The French Institute for International and Strategic Affairs called it a flagrant violation of international law. They warned it makes it impossible to hold up Western democracies as a model.
And there's the core problem, isn't it? The U.S. gets a short-term win, but damages the very system it relies on.
And that brings us directly to Ukraine. This is why an event in Caracas suddenly becomes a huge threat to Kyiv. The sources are clear. This makes achieving a balanced peace in Ukraine almost illusory.
Okay, for our listeners who are focused on the front lines in the Donbass, connect the dots. Why does a regime change in South America destabilize European security so much?
It all comes down to the legal and ideological damage. If Europe, say Paris or Berlin, supports this U.S. action, they are at the same time undermining the very principles they use to oppose Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
You can't condemn Russia for acting in its sphere of influence if you cheer on the U.S. for doing the exact same thing.
Precisely. You lose all moral and legal high ground. But on the other hand, if they condemn the U.S., they risk alienating Washington and straining the transatlantic alliance.
Which is the last thing you need during peace negotiations for the war in Ukraine. It's a strategic trap.
It's a genuine trap.
Yeah.
And in a bizarre way, it's a huge rhetorical gift for Putin. Even as Moscow's global influence is shrinking, in Syria and now Venezuela, this action validates his entire worldview.
That powerful states can just do what they want in their own backyards.
He can now point and say, see, The West is hypocritical. They only care about international law when it helps them.
We already know there's deep suspicion in Kyiv and other European capitals about President Trump's disdain for the continent's elites. Does this make those fragile Ukraine peace talks even harder?
Much, much harder. That distrust is so high now that even if a real opportunity for a deal with Russia emerged, European negotiators might well squander it because they just don't trust the U.S. motives.
They're afraid of being forced into a deal that sells out Ukraine's long-term security.
Yes, they fear the U.S. wants a quick win, not a stable, lasting peace. So the most likely outcome for Ukraine in 2026 remains a continued brutal slog at the front.
Okay, so if the U.S. is willing to risk all that, what are the specific interests they're pursuing now after Venezuela? Who's next on the list?
Well, the strategy is breaking down into a few distinct theaters, each with a different kind of pressure being applied.
Let's start with Brazil. You said they're facing judicial and economic pressure.
That's right. The U.S. slapped 50% tariffs on most Brazilian exports. But the really shocking move was sanctioning a sitting Supreme Court justice, Alexandre de Moraes, under the Global Magnitsky Act.
What does that act actually let the U.S. do to someone?
It's an incredibly powerful tool. It lets the U.S. freeze assets and ban visas for individuals anywhere in the world who are deemed responsible for corruption or human rights abuses.
And the official reason was?
Alleged judicial overreach, suppressing dissent, and censoring what Washington called lawful speech on U.S. soil. But this heavy-handed approach, it's backfiring. It's pushing Brazil closer to China.
Okay, now let's pivot to Colombia, which has been a key U.S. partner for decades.
Relations are at an all-time low. Colombia is now under intense security pressure. The U.S. officially designated it as having failed demonstrably on drug control.
Because cocaine production is up.
Exponentially. So the U.S. strategy is now openly political. They're pushing for a reset in Colombia's 2026 elections, hoping for a more friendly center-right government.
And finally, you mentioned a new energy frontier in the Caribbean and Guyana.
This is a huge geopolitical shift. The Caribbean is basically militarized now, with a naval blockade targeting oil tankers. And Guyana and Suriname, with their massive oil discoveries, are now seen as critical U.S. energy allies. Washington is pouring in investment to stabilize them.
The sources also mention a change in how the U.S. is defining these threats, right? Turning criminals into terrorists.
This is the operational game changer. The administration is now designating transnational criminal organizations, TCOs, as foreign terrorist organizations, or FTOs.
Groups like Venezuela's Tren de Aragua.
Exactly, and Ecuador's Los Choneros. They're also being classed as specially designated global terrorists, or SDGTs.
Break that down for us. What's the practical difference between calling them criminals and calling them terrorists?
It's the difference between a police problem and a military target. That FTO designation grants the U.S. military, quote, legal authorities to target them in ways you can't do if they're just a bunch of criminals.
So, drone strikes, special ops.
All of it. It authorizes the same tools the U.S. uses against groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda. It turns crime fighting into a military mission. And this all leads to the final, and maybe the most important, area of competition, resources. Specifically, the lithium triangle.
That's Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile.
Yes. It contains up to 75% of the world's known lithium reserves. This is the primary battlefield for the U.S.-China critical minerals competition right now.
And we're seeing very different approaches in each of those countries. Let's start with Argentina.
Argentina, under the Milei administration, is the most enthusiastic partner. They've completely opened their markets to foreign capital and are projected to supply over 30% of global lithium by 2026. U.S. diplomacy is all in on supporting them.
Then you have Chile, which was much more restrictive until recently.
Chile was held back by this old 1979 law that classified lithium as a nuclear material, which made it really hard to mine. But the recent election of the conservative José Antonio Cast signals a huge pivot.
He's going to scrap that law.
He's promised to overhaul it and streamline the permitting process. And in Washington, that's seen as a major win against Chinese firms that were trying to get a foothold there.
Which leaves Bolivia. They have the biggest resources, but can't seem to get them out of the ground.
Bolivia's problem is its state-led model. They just signed a billion-dollar deal with the Chinese consortium. But Washington is now expected to put immense pressure on the new Paz administration to look for Western alternatives.
So why all this focus on lithium? Is it just for electric cars?
That's part of it, but the strategic need is much bigger. The U.S. needs reliable lithium sources not just for EVs, but for its own defense systems, military hardware, and for grid energy storage.
And China has a chokehold on the supply chain.
a near monopoly on the processing and refining. So this scramble for raw lithium in the Triangle is a direct response to break that chokehold. Resource access is now a militarized part of U.S. foreign policy. So the outlook for 2026 is one of, well, relentless high-stakes realignment. The U.S. is prioritizing unilateral action, this diplomacy of force. The real test is whether it can offer a compelling economic alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative that isn't just based on threats.
And that really is the final provocative thought for everyone, isn't it? Especially for Europe. The Venezuela raid proved the U.S. is willing to tear up the rulebook to protect its interests. So the question is ousting one dictator worth risking the entire rules-based order that is, right now, the main thing protecting Ukraine?
You've been listening to Defense Report by Alex and Aria, where we analyze the latest in military strategy, global defense, and advanced weaponry. Subscribe to Defense Reports, your go-to source for timely, in-depth military and defense reports. We'll catch you next time.